Do you like large-scale Minecraft projects? Do you also like fantasy and world building? I sure hope so, because today we're in for a video I've been working on for quite some time. Now you may or may not have picked up on the fact that most of my structure builds are on the same world, my fantasy setting known as Azerin. What you likely don't know yet is that for the most part, every build I've done thus far is on the central continent of Azerin, known as Azerin Prime or Primus. However, there are other continents on this world, and today we are venturing to the Forsaken Lands of Haldur, notably the home of Azerin's orc population. I put a ton of work into developing both the build and the narrative for this video, so get yourself ready as I deliver my most lore-packed video to date. It is said that long ago, Azerin was once a supercontinent with a single world soul, a form of primal sentience brought about by magic. The ley lines, which transport magic throughout the land, eventually diverged into different continental plates, which began to develop distinct souls of their own. Haldur was thought to have been a wild yet caring soul, where the land was lush and the wildlife was in harmony. At some point in the distant past, however, disaster struck the land, killing a majority of life on the continent and leaving the survivors sickened. The different peoples of Haldur learned to survive despite their perils. The ones that would become known as the Orcs initially had no unified name for themselves, living in small clan settlements and practicing animistic magic. However difficult life was then, the harshest of times was yet to come. I designed the initial landmass of Haldur a while back as a massive wasteland with a large ominous crater in the center. I've been intending to work on this for a while, but never found myself feeling quite ready to take on this new land. I ended up taking a good deal of inspiration from Jaracraft's Orc City video, making these large multi-layered sandstone columns to add more dimension to the crater. I also took some inspiration from these rock formations that are sometimes called hoodoos. As I was doing some research into different orc aesthetics, I dove deep into Jaracraft's primary inspiration, the Warcraft franchise. As I read into their lore, I realized the kind of story I wanted to tell turned out to align a bit close to what they already did, which surprised me because aside from the Warcraft movie, I hadn't actually consumed that much Warcraft media firsthand. Instead of scrapping my ideas, I decided to just kind of roll with it and take inspiration from a few other notable types of orcs, specifically Warhammer and the OG Lord of the Rings orcs. I hope that by taking bits and pieces of inspiration from many sources, I can cobble together something vaguely original. I make this cracked pit at the center of the crater. Buried deep within this pit lies the source of Haldur's curse, but we'll get to that in a moment. I continue to shape these sandstone plateau structures, trying to make sure they don't look too smooth at any point. I also work on adding plenty of erosion to the sides of the columns to try and match the erosion of the terrain I already had. I used the Metabrush's Axiom add-on for this, which was quite helpful, though I did crash quite a bit when figuring out certain parameters. And now it's time for some backstory. Centuries ago, a Halduran named Orkesh was born into a clan settlement. Like many of his kind, he was born with crippling mutations. Namely, he had weak bones and poor eyesight. Nevertheless, the animist shamans identified his soul as having vast potential, intending to train him into their ranks. However, Orkesh was plagued with vivid nightmares of death and ruin. He started uncontrollably manifesting his magic, which caused things to decay rapidly. Though the shamans realized this was a bleak omen, their clan forbade them from abandoning him entirely, instead trying to teach him to suppress his dark powers. Through meditation, he was able to find some level of success. Then one day, he got into a fight with some of his peers. As the fight dragged on, the magic in his system grew out of control, eventually bursting from his body and reducing his attackers to shriveled husks. The shamans met to determine what to do. Though some thought it best to end him there, a consensus was reached that it was not their place to bring death to one of their own, however dangerous. Ultimately, he was exiled to the Wastes, where the spirits of the land would claim his soul. Banished from his clan, Orkesh roamed the Wastes aimlessly. His dreams became more vivid, and he felt a presence drawing him towards the shattered caves in the center of the land. His people had forbidden anyone from going into the caverns, as it was said that there were monsters that lived there, and the sickness worsens by proximity. Orkesh, who felt he had nothing left to lose, followed the voice into the caverns. At the center of the crater was a pool of tar and some sort of ruined structure. Suddenly, Orkesh was attacked by a massive beast. Though he managed to slay the beast with his entropic magic, he was in a critical state. Deliriously, he waded through the tar. Just as he reached the ruins, he collapsed, his blood spilling on the smooth stone. When he regained his senses, Orkesh found himself in a dreamlike state, but it felt much more lucid this time.
Am I dead? In a sense, we are both dead. But what is death but the shackles myopic fools put upon themselves? You are no fool, are you, Orkesh?
Who are you? How do you know my name?
I am Vishan, greatest of the gods, and I have been watching you for quite some time.
Did you cause the sickness?
Quite the inquiry. I had many grand plans, but my work was interrupted. Haldur's curse is merely an incomplete metamorphosis.
What do you want from me?
So many questions, so little time. I want to give you the strength to lead your people into the future. The answers will come in time, but for now I give you this gift.
Now it's time to start texturing all this terrain I just made. I start by using Axiom's Autoshade to make this gradient. The darker colors indicate the strongest exposure to the corrupted magic that befell the land. Here I quickly replace the tops of the plateaus with sand. For the sandstone I use a combination of EasyEdit's texturing tools and Axiom's Noise Painter. I wanted to strike a balance between maintaining cohesion with the original texturing, while using the more advanced tools available to make something even better. I decided to streamline the gradient from earlier, making it so the terrain closer to the heart of corruption will be more affected by it. And now it's time to have some fun with easy edits. I use the flow texturing tool to make these green veiny patterns of necrotic corruption etched onto the sandstone walls of the terrain. Now I move on to the pit that I had marked earlier. This is of course the same pit where Orkesh had his vision, having collapsed due to him accidentally activating the Shonite ruins with his blood spilt on the stone. I take some time to shape the cracks in the rocks with a portion of gravity-defying debris from ambient magic in the area. I texture the pit with a dark stone gradient and paint in the cracks with the green corruption gradient. Whenever I use the green corruption texture, I also add light blocks corresponding to the place of the adjacent blocks in the gradient to create an extra glowing effect. To finish off the pit, I make this pool of dark water filled with slick tar. I tried my best to make an iridescent sort of gradient for the tar, though it was hard to find blocks that weren't way too saturated for that. I then decided to apply a similar flow field effect from the corrupted stone onto the sandy parts of the plateaus. Now it's time to check back in on our friend Orkesh. When he woke from his slumber, Orkesh found himself sitting on the now floating ruins over the collapsed pit. He immediately noticed a feeling of immense power. His mutations had reversed, his skeleton reknit itself stronger, and he was now able to see the threads of magic that existed everywhere. For the first time since his magic had manifested, he was no longer scared of it, and in fact felt an ecstasy he had never felt before. Beyond just power, though, he had felt purpose. The visions in his head had clarified, and the whispers were now discernible. Orkesh pledged himself to Vishan, becoming known as the Prophet of the Horned God. Using the caverns as his base of operations, he started to plan the construction of his citadel. Speaking of, it's time to actually start working on the citadel itself. I start by making the shattered Shonite pyramid that Orkesh had encountered. This will serve as the base of the citadel tower. Going into this project, I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted the architecture to look. Like I mentioned earlier, I drew inspiration from a myriad of sources to come up with my own aesthetic. For the tower itself, I chose to make it primarily out of jagged stone, as if it was sculpted directly out of the ruins in the corrupted lands. I wanted the tower to stand out quite a bit from the types of houses I will be doing later. I even sketched some concept art to help guide my direction as I built it. Even with the concept art, it was still difficult to know how to start building the tower. As you can see here, I kept redoing the support beams. Here I make some arches reminiscent of the Gothic motifs used in Shonite architecture. I carved some staircases supported by the jagged rocks that make up the structure. These staircases wind around the sides of the tower, eventually converging into the spiral staircase in the center. Now I start to get a feel for the specific look I was going for with the tower. Since this video is just part 1 and mostly dealing with the tower, it's worth mentioning that I wanted different clashing aesthetics here. The tower and some other important structures will be mostly composed of this dark corrupted stone, while the houses will have a blend of different tribal/nomadic aesthetics. The upper part of the tower will house some important rooms such as the High Council chambers and the personal quarters of the Prophet Orkesh. The jaw of the massive skull atop the tower serves as a balcony from which Orkesh can project his voice and address his empire. I make a bunch of circular platforms floating around and attached to different parts of the Citadel. These platforms will have massive pylons for balefire braziers. I then continue to reinforce the base of the tower with more bits of jagged stone. The tower wasn't built by Orkesh alone, as the Prophet knew he needed disciples. Over the next several years, Orkesh began a pilgrimage throughout the lands, using his magic to amplify the voice of his deity. Over time, many shamans heard this calling and abandoned the old ways of animism in favor of necromancy. As Orkesh's following grew, it began to draw concern from the traditionalists, who saw this turn to dark magics as a grave danger. The clans, who had mostly existed in isolation, were now collaborating with each other, each trying to ask the spirits for insights to quell the gathering storm. Spirits, while often aloof and fickle, were known to bring genuine wisdom to the clan leaders. With Orkesh ascendant, however, the shamans could only hear them cry in agony. I had envisioned this tower having spikes on top that resemble fingers of a hand. The hand symbol, known as the Immortal Grasp, had become one of Orkesh's personal emblems, representing his mastery over the forces of life and death itself. I continue using certain Gothic motifs, such as this vaulted ceiling. I really like this juxtaposition of ornate Gothic architecture blended with raw, jagged rock faces. It's almost a metaphor for Orkesh's vain desire to reclaim some long-lost history. Now I make those brazier pylons I mentioned earlier. The balefire from the braziers burn with the ectoplasm of countless souls in order to power the magic of the Citadel. I also make plenty of spiral walkways and bridges so that those in charge of channeling balefire can make sure the braziers are continuously burning. By the time the tower was fully constructed, Orkesh already had supreme reign over all of Haldur, but he did not achieve this without a little trouble from his dissenters. Orkesh's forces, who had begun to be known as the Orcs, had continued to consolidate power over the years. No longer skulking in the shadows of the crater, they began recruiting more aggressively. Eventually, Orkesh was able to broadcast his ultimatum not just to his own kind, but all who call the lands of Haldur home.
I give you all a choice. Embrace the truth of the Horned One or face your doom.
This message brought many to his cause, and it became clear that neutrality was no longer an option. The resistance formed a council made up of the leaders among the warriors and shamans of the clans. They elected the matriarch Annika as their leader, who developed a plan of repeatedly striking the recruitment and supply chains. However, Orkesh was well aware of this resistance, and in fact it was his agents that led to Annika's appointment as leader. When the resistance leadership met in secret, they were promptly ambushed by a large contingent of Orc forces. Orkesh himself appeared, for he couldn't miss the chance to personally challenge Annika. Atop a mesa overlooking the battle, the two fought furiously, Annika being able to not only stand her ground but press the advantage. Though she was wounded herself, she was able to pierce Orkesh through the heart. Fighting her exhaustion, she proclaimed to her enemies that their prophet was dead. Her victory was short-lived, however, as Orkesh's body began to reanimate itself rapidly. Annika, who was frozen in shock, was promptly kicked off the edge of the mesa. The remainder of the resistance was quickly destroyed or converted to his cause. At this point, you may be wondering why Orkesh had taken such care to infiltrate the resistance and elevate Annika to a position of leadership. The first reason is rather simple. He knew that some amount of time down the line there would be resistance to his new order, and so he opted to gather all who opposed them in a single place in order to eliminate them. The second reason is even more insidious. Orkesh wanted full control of his people's destiny. To do this, he had to twist the more ambiguous gender roles among the clans by pinning the role of arch-traitor to the wise woman Annika. The prophet divided his society into three castes. The Magus caste, reserved for the magic-wielding leaders, the Warrior caste, 3 clans of able-bodied males, and the Thrall caste, the rest of the Orc population. Interestingly, only the true kin of Orkesh followed this strict hierarchy, with certain allies such as the Ogre clan still having female chieftains. The structure here is the primary harem, a housing unit for the most genetically stable of orc women. Relative to most other thralls, the women that live here are treated with a degree of reverence due to their unblemished nature. This system of selective breeding is, like most things in the Orc Empire, designed for brutal efficiency. The goal is to create the most capable and warlike offspring by curbing any unwanted mutations and cultivating useful strains. Now I finish up some of those pylons from earlier and spam more of those braziers around the jagged stone as well. With the shape of the tower finished for the most part, it's finally time to start texturing. Like before, I use a combination of Axiom and Easy Edits to color the placeholder blocks. I realize though that there's an issue here. All the stone bits make the build mostly gray. Aside from the necrotic green veins, there's a pretty large absence of saturated color. To help with this, I decided to make some large flowing banners that will have a classic deep red. Aside from being colorful, these banners will help add some movement to the otherwise static structure. I also added some war paint in the shape of claw marks around the tower, just to give a little bit more color to the build. The very top of the tower is Orkesh's personal quarters. After securing total control of Haldur, the Prophet was rarely seen in person by most of his people, instead relegating leadership duty to the Archmagi and spending most of his time communing with his master in this ritual area. It took me a while to come up with a decent design for this magic symbol. I went through some standard symbols, but I wanted something a bit more specific, so I eventually ended up on this eye symbol, something similar to one of the mage circles I used on Vizshan. Here I make Orkesh's office, so to speak. I didn't make a bedroom for him because his meditations negate his need for traditional sleep entirely. For this video, I wanted to include this shot of the eye emblem visible through the socket of the massive skull. Almost done here. I'm just going to fix up some of the stonework connecting the top to the rest of the tower. Lastly, I add some oozing tar dripping between the fingers of the hand and the skull. With that done, part 1 is complete. Alright, a couple quick thoughts before I wrap the video up. I wanted to shout out Orkforge for their awesome orc themed music. Most of my videos have used music by Adrian von Ziegler, whose music I've gotten incredible mileage out of, but I needed a specific vibe, so I searched on Bandcamp and found Orkforge. Just to be clear, I'm not sponsored or anything. I genuinely just prefer to purchase an album or two from Bandcamp than go on those subscription-based music services, though no shame if you prefer that either. Secondly, I want to say that I've been obsessing a bit over this video, trying to get every detail as good as I possibly can, and to some extent I hope it shows, in a good way of course. Having not found much success on this platform, I feel like this sort of pivot to more passion project stuff, instead of algorithm chasing, is good for me. That probably sounds super cliche, but I believe it. Lastly, I wanted to thank you, yes you, for sticking through this video to this point. I know this kind of content is probably not going to have much mass appeal. In a way, I feel like being a tiny channel makes every new comment and subscriber have much more weight to me. So if you liked the video, please do all the engagement stuff so my algorithm stonks go up and my neurotransmitters can do a happy dance. Also keep an eye out for part 2, hopefully it won't take as long as it probably won't be as lore heavy. Oh, and if you made it this far, even if you skipped ahead or whatever, do me a favor and comment something orc related. Could be a quote, could be your favorite depiction of orcs, could be whatever. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.